So I thought, well, it's only me. I didn't really worry too much about it. I did what I could. I was very task focused, as I had to be. But then I got involved in the homicide victim support group in WA, and I realised through a lot of great role models, one of which is in this room today, who I met there and who I had a lot of encouragement. And all the way through my life, I've had these little beacons of hope. And it didn't matter if it was somebody I met for an hour at a school camp who told me I was extremely intelligent and one day I'd write a book, and hey, now I've written 2 of them. I think about what that woman said to me and how much it meant. I think about what meeting Harvey had meant to me and him encouraging me to be the voice for other people. So I learned all about justice. I studied hard, and here I am, this professional with this bio. But what have I learnt? Well, as practitioner, you can't go back and you can't start again, but we can all help people start from now so that they've got a new end, that they realise that there are new hopes. And I went to Florida 3 years ago, I think it's 3 years ago, to the World Symposium of Victimology, and I had the chance to speak to the Emeritus Professor Taylor from New Zealand, and he was talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how he changed it. And I loved this because it fitted so well for what victims of crime went through. They still managed to function, they still managed to keep it going, but if we think of safety, and he stressed that for victims of crime, safety was about the ability to feel safe, to feel relaxed, and to experience justice. Now, when we talk about justice, justice has 5 components. It's got social justice, moral justice, political justice, economic justice, and legal justice. And in a Western world, we focus so much on legal justice, we forget what we can all do about the other aspects. So to me, when you think about supporting victims of crime and when you think about their needs, think about them in this way, that they're on a milking stool, and if any one of the legs of the stool is short, then they're going to be off kilter. Yeah? So it was a great analogy. Those of you probably can't read all the words there, but through my PhD research, I identified several elements and characteristics of helpful support, and I'm happy to send that information to anybody, and I'm sure I'm almost out of time. 5 more minutes? Okay, so I won't go through all of those things because they're all basic things and they're all things that we know. But we need to put them up and we need to remind ourselves of them as practitioners and as people in our everyday lives. It's not something that we just reserve for when we're in our offices. So my approach to helpfulness, it's pretty simple. First thing I do is offer people hope. Now, I've heard of people going to counsellors, and I myself have experienced sitting in front of somebody who bursts into tears and says, I don't know how to help you. I think I need to send you to somebody with more specialised skills. It's okay to be human. The tears didn't even worry me because the alternative of making it sound like I said I just washed my car, and this total no affect thing is almost as bad. But helping them to have hope, well, look, and the most hopeful beacon in my journey was a chaplain, and I'm not very religious. People say I'm spiritual, I'm not sure. I'm just me, and I believe in good and bad. But this woman sat in front of me and she said, and she was English, she goes, my child. What's that mean? But she goes, my child, I have no idea of what you need, but I just want to let you know I'm here and together we'll try and find ways to get your needs met. That was the most hopeful line I heard in the first 2.5 weeks. Up until then, psychologists had told me I'll be angry, I'll go through this is what will happen to you. Doctors had pushed and poked and prodded my body, and nurses had fed my soul with what they could. But again, none of them knew what to do, and none of them had talked about the future. This was the first woman who offered me a ray of hope. She offered me an empathetic way of educating me about what was happening in my world. She educated me about the grief, the trauma I was experiencing, and the systems that I needed to negotiate. She listened lovingly. We didn't just sit in an office. We went to a coffee shop. We went for a walk in my wheelchair. She did things that were just just that bit nicer than sitting in a sterile office. But when she knew I needed to cry, she took me to a private place. It was lovely. It was so human. And she helped me be proactive and participate at whatever point I could in making decisions and choices. And that began for me with funerals. And people say, how did you do that? Well, I don't know, but her and my sister managed to allow me the processes and access to make every decision about the children's funerals. And those of you who are involved in death and dying rituals, one of the lessons I've learnt there is when there are multiple deaths involved, get the funeral homes to allow extra time for people to actually spend when there's more than one person. That was something that I didn't have enough time for. And the other thing, I was in a wheelchair, so I couldn't actually see properly. And that really sucks. It's so hard not to be able to say goodbye. So think about some of those practical aspects of the people that you're walking beside. If they're from another culture, then think about what their spiritual needs are. How quickly can we get this autopsy done? It's bad enough that somebody's murdered, but if they're not going to the God that they should be going to, with all the rituals, I know of Catholics who can't even get their last rites. And for families, the worst thing is the last hands that touched them weren't necessarily loving ones. So find ways to allow those things to happen. And that works from a strengths perspective. Don't think of this person as somebody who's weak and vulnerable and a victim. There's somebody who's got a whole lot of strengths, a whole lot of life experiences, and they will find a way to get through if they've got a tour guide. Because I talk about our journey of life, we all need tour guides. And that's what we do for victims of crime. We provide a helpful tour guide on their journey through a landscape that they never ever wanted to know about. I think it's important to help them find the strategies that they need to master their symptoms and let them know there are ways. I talk about perspective. Society gives you 12 weeks to get it together, or else you're locked up in the loony bin. You're not getting it right, So help them find ways to master those early symptoms. Help them to understand the criminal justice system is a rational, logical process for dealing with irrational, illogical behaviours and emotions. It's never going to meet their needs emotionally. It's a legal, rational process, and they can understand that quite well and say, well, that's what's going to deal with the legalities and the procedural stuff, and we're going to walk along with the emotional, irrational stuff. Let people know what your role is and its parameters, because they don't know what it means to be the witness worker. They don't know what it means to be the victim support worker. To them, that means you're going to give them everything they need. Be clear, unpick it, unravel it, unpack it with them. The roles and other professionals and services, help them to understand what other people's roles are. I worked in restraining orders for ages, far too long. I feel a bit old when I say that. But, people used to come, and these women, they were so scared. And remember that we're asking people who've never met us before to sit down in front of us, and for all the ladies in the room, it's the equivalent of sharing your stretch marks in public, and for guys it's the equivalent of getting measured up in public. Okay, let's see what goods are on offer, let's see how good your body is. They're putting their most vulnerable self on the table and saying, I need help. And they would sit themselves down in front of me and say, legal aid told me to come down here and see you, you're going to help me? And I'd say, well, what do you think I'm going to help you with today? I don't know. The person up at Legal Aid just told me to come and see you and you'll fix it. They had no idea that I was going to help them get a restraining order or what and Legal Aid probably wasn't the right organisation to pick there as my example, but lots of professionals sent them down, or they didn't unravel what my role would be. So be really helpful about that. Help them to have realistic expectations. I'm going to be a bit like that judge yesterday. I'm going to say I really don't care if I run over time. Because did you notice how none of us questioned it because he was a judge? We all just sat there. I mean, bollocks. No way. No way. I worked on hours for this model. Years, in fact. This model, and those of you in the presentation yesterday about my PhD would have heard me refer to this model. This model reflects all the numerous systemic things down the left-hand side, right-hand side, I don't know, your left, my right, side of the screen. Now, every single one of those professionals takes years to learn their profession. There are umpteen amounts of technical jargon and theories and whole lots of crap that go in there to make you a professional. Okay, the other part is the impact, the social consequences, all of the aspects of crime that someone sitting before you may or may not be dealing with. You're only dealing with one part of that as a victim's advocate often. Remember, when you're in trauma, you're confused, you're forgetful, your hypervigilance is up, Don't assume that the person will absorb everything, but understand this whole totality of complexity that they're walking in is walking into that room with you. I once heard a district court judge say, I don't know why victims can't get to court. I mean, 9:30, come on. Why can't they get there? It's not that hard. They want to hear the outcome. Get there. And I said, well, they're probably on antidepressants. They probably find getting out of bed in the morning difficult. They're probably really fuzzy. They don't know which court. How many people know victims that go to the wrong court? Yeah, they don't know the difference between the magistrates' court, the district court, the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal. They don't know any of that. And unless somebody's taken the time, and what do we know, 10 to 15% of victims of crime access support services? They've got to know where to park. They've got to have a car. They've got to have access to transport. There's 10,000 million things they've got to do before they even get to the criminal justice system's door. And this is just a little bit of an overview, and I'll get off my soapbox. So, as a practitioner, being cognizant that there is inherent trauma between the trauma recovery models and the criminal justice system. Trauma recovery is information, participation and involvement in healing, to understand, to integrate. Knowledge is power, power is knowledge. We all know Foucault, don't we? Yeah? And yet the first thing the criminal justice system does is take information away from victims, renders them powerless, because they don't have the knowledge that they need often to integrate what's happened, especially if they're a witness, and understand and begin to take some control over their trauma symptoms. Interventions need to be consistent. It's no good being up and down and all over the shop. Now, somebody in trauma, and particularly when you're working with people who've had ongoing abuse, family violence, ongoing incest or child sexual abuse, people are tuned into the very tone of your voice. If somebody walks into your office while you're on the telephone to somebody who's experienced family and domestic violence or ongoing abusive behaviours, they will notice the change in your voice. Do not pretend it didn't happen. Own it. Because for somebody whose trust in the world has just been shattered, if you don't say, look, somebody just walked into my office, I'm a bit distracted, could you just hold on while I ask them to leave, or at least explain that they've left again and you're going to resume your conversation, that person's trust in you and your relationship is so tenuous it will have just been severely threatened. Trauma impacts on problem solving and basic function levels. Now, we all know that here, but remember it when our people are sitting in front of us.